You're watching The Real Talk Show, and this episode has been a kind of experience for me. I have with me Mr. Uday Arya, who has had a chance to experience some of the tremendous career transitions over the years until he returned to India and settled down to do something which he always wanted to do: teaching. The man is an angel investor, has worked in structured finance at Wall Street, and then settling to listen, understand, and find his true self. There's a lot to learn from this man. We talked about angel investing, its pros and cons, critical thinking, the need of critical thinking, and also about history, the way it is taught and the way it should be taught. So there's something for everyone to learn from this particular episode. And one thing which I'm pretty sure about, this episode will definitely give you an urge to put in some extra efforts to find the purpose of your life. Here's the man, Mr. Uday Arya, on The Real Talk Show. Welcome to The Real Talk Show, Uday Arya sir. And thanks a lot for firstly agreeing to do this. And I hope you enjoy this conversation. And I hope that I bring out some of your wisdom, your learnings through our conversation, so that our audiences could gain something out of this podcast. And the idea of doing this podcast is this. So yeah.
Okay,
Thanks
I
for
understood. No, thanks for having me. Thanks for having me, and I hope I'm able to share something of value too. So, looking forward.
Great. While I was going through your LinkedIn profile for preparing for this podcast, I found out that you have made some massive transition in your professional career from
Yeah,
working in financial sector in New York, then shifting to doing angel investing, and then moving back to India and doing teaching. What
yeah.
I feel, this transition is more of self realization and realizing the purpose of your life, getting to
Mhm.
understand the purpose of your life. I wish to know from you, how do you view this transition of your career?
Okay, I think the seeds for these transitions were probably planted many years ago, moons ago. Perhaps when I was in high school, towards the end of my high school, when I was in Bangalore, I was about 17, and I had a couple of experiences at the time, which during school, which led me to believe that perhaps it would be really fun and engaging and worthwhile to be back in a classroom. So the intent was to actually somehow figure out a way to be back in a classroom, because I thought I would really enjoy teaching a lot. So as the career took shape, I had no idea I would end up in New York and go work for a bank. That was the last thing on my mind, honestly. But it just took place that way, and the idea was always there that I would come back to India and come back to be a part of a school or university or some sort of educational environment closer to home, and especially closer to Pondicherry, where I was originally born. So it took substantially longer than I anticipated. When I first left India in 2003 Jan, it felt like I was just going for a few years, maybe 5, 6, 7 years, but it ended up being a little bit longer than that. But
Hmm.
it's okay. It was a good collection of experiences, and the goal was to be back eventually. The goal was not to quote unquote settle down and become a naturalized citizen of another country, or it wasn't for the conveniences as such.
So while you were there in US, something which wasn't your call, as you told that you had that realization that you had to return to India and you had to
Yeah,
do something which was related to teaching. So
yeah,
when you were back in US, when you were working for the bank,
yeah,
I guess the thought of returning to India must have popped a lot of times, maybe every day, that I have a different purpose and I have to come back and all those stuffs. How
yeah.
did you cope those moments, or how did you cope those times when you had such thoughts, but you had to stay there and you had to work for the banks?
So honestly, it wasn't a daily thought or a monthly thought. Even I just knew that I would eventually make it back. But I think the first 2 years of banking were especially hard because I ended up being, in the center seat of a proprietary trading desk in New York at a French bank, which was super high pressure, very different than I had ever anticipated. And it was a trading group. So there were about 7 or 8 people, and it was an enormous amount of learning that was to be expected in a very, very short duration of time. Terms, ideas, concepts, and even culturally, I was not used to it. Like I grew up with interests in music, playing the tabla, photography, poetry. Fine, I ended up becoming an engineer, but it's not like I wanted to become an engineer. I wanted to become something else. Maybe I had interest in physics when I was graduating from school. But anyway, the environment in New York in that particular group was so different and so intense, and I almost revolted at that experience, even though it taught me a ton. But I knew this was not cut out for me. I was not meant to participate in high stakes deal making. I was not meant to be a part of a cutthroat culture. It had its negatives, let's just say, and it wasn't for me. Now, some people who are perfectly fine with a high pressure deal making environment, and that trading group where you typically are taking micro advantages of the other person. It's like poker, right? You're playing a very, very quick high stakes poker game with real resources on the line, and mistakes are absolutely not okay. They will cost you and your firm substantially. So I hadn't really expected to be in that type of environment. It was a learning, but after that, once I moved out of that trading group, right before the financial crisis hit, I was a part of a risk management group at my French bank, and that was a very different experience. So the thoughts of returning to India weren't quite there on a monthly basis, but I just knew that I had to stick it out a little longer to gather the experiences and also importantly aim to be financially independent, because I knew that there was no real pay involved in education or in teaching, and I didn't want to be constrained by having to work at a place which would pay me more or less. I didn't want to have to depend on those types of things, and so I wanted to be financially independent before I returned. So and I had to be conservative in these assumptions as well, because the cost of living in India was rising every year. So there was a bit of a race on that front, but yes, it finally did fall in place.
Great. Uh, do you have any childhood memories or any experiences when you were growing that you think has an impact or is very influencing to the kind of person you are transforming now?
Okay, I think the most important, I guess, set of experiences are the experiences of growing up in a free environment. So I was, I guess, super fortunate to have been in a family environment where they encouraged a ton of freedom and individual responsibility. And they, in retrospect, gave me so much freedom that I can't imagine now giving the same, I just very hard. It's just incredible what they've done. But that aspect of growing up in freedom and being held accountable to my own decisions and not really from top down. So I wasn't policed really as a child, and that allowed me to be myself throughout. And I can only be super grateful to my parents for having done that. But also, school experiences were transformative in the sense that not just high school or pre-high school, but even in college, I was fairly disappointed with the kind of education I had, or the classroom settings that I had, and I seeked out and I actively sought out a place of excellence, some place which allowed for a lot more creative inquiry, exploration. It wasn't, you know how it is in most schools in India. Conventional schools are very drab, very, they will make sure you don't get an education. So you sort of have to make sure that you get an education on the outside, right? You have to be seeking an education independently. So yes, so we used to buy books. My parents used to let me go buy books from different bookshops. There was, a lot of free time after school, so I could commit the mistakes that I wanted to, and so that I think was transformative, and that allows me to still be flexible, and I continue to be a learner just like I was when I was younger, because I had that curiosity, and that now we have the internet. Since the last 20 years or so, we've had the phenomenal resources to learn. So yeah, those have been the main experiences that have shaped and continue to shape me.
Cool. Since you're moving closer, realizing your purpose of life and having a deeper sense of self realization, how
Yeah.
has your mental state been over the years, or how has you grown up mentally in terms of being more calm and composed and handling situations and various other aspects in a very better manner?
Okay, that's a good question. I think throughout I have generally been of a calm disposition. I don't, perhaps it's genetics, I don't know. But the few years where I didn't really have a calm disposition were those intense years in the opening 3 years of my career in New York, where I had to transform my own personality to be not calm. It
Hmm.
was a very different experience, but and it wasn't pleasant. So it actually grated against my personality type. And so after that, since then I was able to find these opportunities within the institution, within the firms, to find a role that sort of, luckily, I would also add, matched my
Hmm.
temperament, which is by nature calm. And it's now that I'm in a teaching role at a school and university, it's sort of even more important to continue to be calm and disposed, because the lesson that students take away is significantly more on behavior than actual textual knowledge or any
Hmm.
sort of information that you may transmit. So I also learned a fair bit from a good manager, who taught me a lot about how to deal with difficult individuals, difficult situations. And he was extremely calm and reserved, and he was able to demonstrate what many courses at B school when I was in at NYU could not really do, because he would be a live demonstration of how to deal with these situations. So I think that was super helpful. And
Hmm.
as I continue to believe that you learn best from example. So as I observed him, I started to observe others around the firm, and I used to sort of want to emulate them. They were, I can only say that it was a meritocracy. So I used to really appreciate to see these fantastic individuals rise, because of who they were and what they did, and not so much about where they came from or the color of their skin. It was very fascinating to see that the best do rise. And yeah, so the mental state over time has continued to evolve more in that direction of, I guess, composed and not too perturbed. And now also with this side thing that's happening, in terms of angel investing, also this temperament is important, not just in the public markets, in the private markets.
Hmm.
Any kind of involvement, if it comes with any level of excitement, is a little troublesome, because then you are more likely to make mistakes.
Hmm.
Right? There's a greater danger of losing control over your balanced self.
Great. You talked about in the last part that it is required, and I completely agree to that point, that you just can't afford a lot of excitement when you are doing investing. And when you are investing and you're doing angel investing, you cannot afford a lot of excitement and impatience. Could you just
Yeah.
elaborate over that point and tell how being calm and composed actually helps you a lot in making better decisions when you are involved in doing angel investing or investing in general?
Sure. So actually, my background from angel investing, or prior to angel investing, was the affiliation with value investing. And for I guess from 2010 onwards, I had been associated with, and I started to learn about value investing once I came across some course at NYU on valuation, and there I came across the writings of Warren Buffett. So for many years, I studied and learned from the letters and thought processes of these legendary value investors. Buffett, of course, Charlie Munger, Sid Klarman, Lee Lu, Prem Vatsa, Chuck Aker, Tom Russo. All these guys had their letters online. They still do, right? To a great extent, for anybody who's really curious, these letters still exist online, and these are the some of the most thoughtful individuals who've actually shared their thought processes out for everybody to read. If there is a curiosity, you will find it. And what's fascinating is, for me, they were intriguing, they were eye-opening. All these individuals were multidisciplinary, so they were not just letters on valuation of XYZ company, but they thought about competition. They thought about so many things holistically. They borrowed mental models from so many different fields, and so this was prior to the phase when mental models became cool. Now mental models, it's a very well known term, but these guys were actually not advertising these as mental models, but they were just coming, sharing their ideas, and the way they approached, how they look at so many different aspects and complex. It's investing is so hard, and they continually demonstrated their open mindedness and their humility, and that kind of objectivity. And it was very scientific. Actually, it was as scientific as I'd ever come across, and that was eye opening for me. And so that aspect of value investing was fascinating, and all these individuals were calm. Every one of these were very cool-headed, very very relaxed. They did not hurry any time for their decisions, and they took their sweet time. You may even add, so in some cases waiting months, some cases waiting years before acting, right? So that demonstrates that you can pursue a certain idea, you can be thoughtful about it, you can wait for the right opportunity when the stars align, so to speak. And the homework that's required is a multi-year, if not a multi-decade effort. It's a very very long period of time during which you're training yourself. As Bruce Lee mentioned, you're training for that one kick 10,000 times, right? So you're really learning a ton before you make even that small decision. And so coming from that background, I originally started looking out for superb capital allocators in the Indian context. That was the original motivation, in fact, to when I would come back to India, to not have to actually deal with the nuances and the difficulties and the challenges of investing, and to just give the savings to a responsible steward of capital, and let things grow. Because I had figured out by then that you can be an owner. If you have an ownership mindset, you can own outstanding businesses and just hold on to them for a long period of time, and you'll do just fine. But it does take effort. It's not easy to identify all these excellent businesses, and it's also not easy to stick with your decision. So it's best to find somebody in a trusted space where you can say, okay, you can manage this stuff. So that was one aspect of it, which was on the public market side. And I also knew by 2017, because I had come in touch with the writings or the thoughts of Naval Ravikant, who's now a well-known superstar in the online Twitter world, etc. Right? So I'd come across his interview with Shane Parrish. I think that was Feb 2017. And that was one of the best interviews I'd heard at the time. And very, very thoughtful chap, this Naval. And I looked him up more, read up more about him. And I also felt that given that I was returning to India, I also should be, even though I'm not coming from a major family background. I don't come from great wealth, family wealth as such. But even though I had saved a little bit, I should try and support to the extent possible a small some percentage of the portfolio in startups, because it is risky. It's for sure not for everybody. At the same time, one has to have a risk appetite for it, right? And it's a very different space. It's such a different space because there are no financials, there are no return ratios, there's no track record of the management to look at, right? So the kind of thesis one has to develop is a lot more subtle. It's a lot more subjective, and it I feel it also requires of some bit of training to begin with. And it's not easy. I can only say this much. I've been doing it for about 3.5, almost 4 years now. I can only say it's not easy. So yeah, I think that's been the approach, and it's clearly not for everyone. But I think more and more people who can participate in the space should, if it's possible for them to participate. It would be really good.
Great. Like, I guess this is from Naval only, that he in one of his podcasts said that if you want to be a millionaire give your billions of dollars in angel investing and you would become a millionaire.
That's right. That's right. That's a very good one. It's a very sharp, incisive comment on how
Yeah,
people should be thinking about this space. And what the media does is the exact opposite, right? So they go and
exactly.
glorify the rare few angels who've actually done phenomenally well. Luck plays a very large role, undoubtedly, right? And in this current excessively heated environment that we find ourselves in 2021, mid 2021, despite having a year and a half of COVID, many people are perhaps unnecessarily congratulating themselves or patting their backs for an outstanding last 1.5 year. It's been driven by factors well beyond our hands, and I
Hmm.
think if we are really honest, it's other factors that drive this creation of wealth and resources.
Yeah. You talked about you have to do your own thesis and things are not very clearly objective and there are subjective things that go on while you do angel investing.
Yeah, yeah.
What do you mean by doing thesis and how do you personally go about doing your thesis while you are thinking of investing in some startup? How do you go about it?
So, the first and foremost, I guess the most important aspect of the startup evaluation is the quality of the founders,
Hmm.
which means where do they come from? What have their experiences been? What's their drive and motivation? How do we judge or get some idea about their abilities? And if you can get some more research, so it's not like always you always have this type of information, but naturally one can dig up as much as possible about the founders because a great deal of the startup's probability of survival, I wouldn't even say forget multi-bagger, just survival depends on how these individuals react and
Hmm.
how they behave in times of difficulty and stress, and there will inevitably be these times, right? So I think a great amount of time goes in that kind of research on what these founders might be like. And it's not always that just because they have fancy credentials or they come from great schools or universities, they will necessarily do well.
Hmm.
Although now in today's space, pretty much anything is funded at any valuation. I think more than one instance in our own experience, founders who have not graduated from college, or in fact, in some cases, not even graduated from high school, have done phenomenally well because they've demonstrated their grit. They've
Hmm.
had, I think that's probably the most important characteristic, grit, right? So obviously it comes packaged with, the insatiable willingness to learn, to adapt, and to hustle. Naturally, all these things are, non-negotiable. One has to have these things as a good founder
Hmm.
because things keep changing in front of you every week, every month. Things keep changing, and you can't stick with your thesis for too long. And you might have to pivot, and it's okay to pivot sometimes, right? So founder, and then a product market fit, obviously. So is there a real need for the solution being offered? Is there a real problem to begin with? So how real is the problem? How real is this? Is there a need for this a particular
Hmm.
solution? And obviously trying to gauge the strength of the competition. Sometimes you might have competition that is underappreciated or below the radar or obvious, but you want to ignore, right? And that's
Hmm.
the one thing that will come back and bite you later because if you didn't think about it or you didn't articulate it at the time you were making that decision, these are going to be flaws in the analysis. Apart from this, there's a great deal of subjectivity that goes into the analysis of a single startup. Sometimes, in the first 3 hours or 5 hours of thinking about a certain idea that the time for this has probably come. So which means the timing is right, but
Hmm.
is the particular team right? We don't know. So I try and train myself. I try and educate myself through various frameworks, through the experiences of others. Naturally, some bit of the past experiences through reading the letters of these fine investors
Hmm.
in the value investing space has certainly helped. But there are also many young, very talented individuals who have been in the space for, let's call it, a decade or so, who have very valuable experiences. And I think listening to them through their podcasts or through their writings in some cases. People don't
Hmm.
write as much as I would like, but they do share via the audio medium at least. So one has to sort of continually refine these theses, and just because some idea was used 6 months ago or a year ago doesn't mean we have to sort of stick with it. So we might have to just adapt because there's too much that changes too often.
Right.
So yeah, that's the broad
Great,
that's the
great,
broad
great.
frame.
From the kind of conversation we are having, the vibe that I'm getting, it's quite infectious, in terms that you're doing a lot of stuffs, and then you are maintaining such a calm and composed in a peaceful state of mind, and that's like really something which most of us would really want to attain, and that's actually hard to attain. Do you do any kind of morning journals, or do you meditate? Do you follow any kind of morning routine that actually sets the tone of your day right? Because I feel that the first hour in the morning is basically something that actually sets the kind of day you are going to have. So
Yeah.
do you follow any kind of morning routine?
Yeah, I do, and I think while I don't want to advertise any particular routine or
Hmm.
make the claim that anything is particularly helpful, everybody has their own. Some people have a night routine, or they go to
Hmm.
sleep thinking about something. I think it's obviously important to sleep well, but in terms of morning routine and meditation, yes, of course, there are some aspects or some time during the day or sometimes during the week when this has to take place. But there are different individuals who have different temperaments, and some people may not be doing meditation and yet may be quite able to handle that day. And so I don't want to make the claim that this is the one thing, but yeah, I mean, if one can get up at a reasonable hour and start planning for the day effectively, it can be a day well handled, and you get to go to sleep that night feeling accomplished, that you did your small 1 cent or 2 cents,
Hmm.
something tiny, which you did intend to start out at the beginning of the day. And each of these days compounds over time, right? So whether you wanted to get to a particular reading that you wanted to do, some philosophical reading, something on investing, I don't know, something on teaching,
Hmm.
education. We have, I mean, we're all multifaceted now, right? We all have multiple personalities. We're not single. We deal with so many different topics, and we're continually educating ourselves in so many different lines. So if we could just turn down the distractions in some way and make that make it meaningful, I think that would help a lot. In fact, talking about distractions, I want to get this book in front of you before the end, which is a pretty nice book. It's called Indistractable.
Great,
Yeah,
sir. Great. Also,
yeah,
you, as a teacher,
yeah,
you actually try to inculcate critical thinking in students, and also introduce history to high school students. We'll discuss both of
yeah.
these, but first, moving to
Okay,
the critical thinking part. What
yeah.
is critical thinking for you? Like, how do you define critical thinking?
Oh, a wide field, but being able to be aware of what you think and why you think what you think, being careful with one's deductions, observations, takeaways, is sort of the framework of how do we get better as independent thinkers and not be strayed too much or too strongly by groupthink. So
Hmm.
groupthink, I think, is in one of the major problems in an advanced democracy like the United States, for example, now, which is heavily partitioned into left versus right, red versus blue, and this versus mentality, compartmentalization. It's a demonstration actually of the lack of good critical thinking, and one has internalized this us versus them, me versus you. These
Hmm.
things have gotten very, very strong, and it's just education. One, if we are able to educate ourselves well to question and ask tons of questions, we should not end up in that type of situation. I think we can avoid and be much better for the future by training ourselves to ask and be more reflective before acting or thinking. So acting is sort of
Hmm.
the sequel to thinking. So if we can go back to the drawing board and refine how we think, I think many good outcomes can happen for ourselves and naturally in a classroom for students too.
Hmm. Great. Like, when you interact with students, do you find that they particularly lack this skill of critical thinking? And through interactions, what do you feel could be the possible reasons for this lack?
Um, So I don't want to be judgmental per se,
Hmm.
but I think all of us have at some point of time lacked these
Hmm.
skills, right? And our school systems, generally speaking, don't encourage critical thinking because the school environment is actually not conducive to asking questions. And I think it's really the responsibility of a collective teacher's body to try and inculcate the habit of encouraging questions rather than giving information. So, if we can manage that, we've done it because students, once they know that they can be on autopilot, don't need us.
Hmm.
Students don't need teachers per se. If they become lifelong learners on their own, you're done, right? You're okay because they will figure out what they're interested in and they will teach themselves everything that they need to learn. So, of course, one can be available as a mentor, etc. We can come to that later, but I think the idea of just changing what a classroom experience is meant to be like, that can go a very, very long way. So, do they not have critical thinking skills? I would just say they get better through the year at
Hmm.
these things, and they get more conscious of their own biases, their own assumptions, their own, I guess, laziness. And I can also say, I mean, I was lazy at an earlier age too. I didn't think about certain issues that I think about now. So,
Hmm.
sure, we're all getting better, but as and that's the aim and objective of a classroom. It should be intense enough where we ask these questions in a safe space where we don't literally judge somebody else for not thinking through something. But if you're able to encourage that persistence and to not actually tire out just because it involves thinking. That's one of the
Hmm.
things I actually say at the beginning of the class. Like, I'm not sure why you signed up for critical thinking because most people actually don't like to think, right? And we're doing like months of this. We're doing 8 9 months of this of a course on critical thinking, and that will take a substantial amount of effort on your part to think through things.
Exactly. Great, sir. Uh, Also, what I personally feel, critical thinking,
Hmm.
logical reasoning, understanding and making processes efficient, curriculums that actually focuses upon building better systems and making students more aware about their surroundings. These are certain things which education system should focus on rather than just rote learning.
Yes.
Then why, according to you, are we still following the rote education system, and why we aren't shifting to such a system of education where we actually try to build and inculcate qualities that motivate students to learn and learn for a purpose?
So I think we're moving slowly in that direction after this new education policy that has come
Hmm.
about. I am optimistic. I think things will change. It might take 5 10 years, but I think we're heading in a good direction. From a top down perspective, obviously from a bottoms up perspective, a lot depends on how teachers themselves adapt and
Hmm.
change. We have to keep changing our own approach. So the danger here is us teachers getting lazy,
Hmm.
right? Because things, we can't use things from 5 years ago or 10 years ago. It has to continually adapt and become fresh for the students. And look, I'm teaching a particular course called critical thinking, but it could well be that teachers have a general course which could be on other subjects, and you introduce critical thinking through your other subjects, right? There could be
Hmm.
so many. In fact, every subject, you even a language, you can introduce the idea of critical thinking from teaching a language, but you just have to be more creative. You will have to spend more time redesigning your curriculum. You'll have to think about how to introduce certain ideas, and you have
Hmm.
to sort of invite the student to be more a participant in that journey of self discovery,
Hmm.
right? And that all that takes effort. So it takes months and months of effort for a teacher to try and put that down in a systematic way, and to sort of
Hmm.
plan for each class so that it is effective. Naturally, this takes effort, right? And in most teaching environments, there is no real reward for this effort except the joy of learning and the joy of teaching itself. But if one is motivated by finance, by just financial outcomes, or by a potential promotion or somebody else's praise, it won't really fly, right? It has to sort of be more internal, or there has to be some driving factor where you actually genuinely feel that this needs to be done and it's worth doing. and all that time and effort is actually worthwhile. So one has to have that belief, that faith, and then the means follow. Naturally, the means will follow. So why is it not happening? I think it is happening slowly. I think many schools and perhaps many colleges also are, it's the teachers. It may not be, a formal subject that is introduced called critical thinking, but I do think that teachers everywhere, not just in India, but throughout, are getting more conscious of their role, more aware of their purpose in a classroom. And I think that old idea of lecturing to students is, receding. It might still be the main or dominant theme, but I think it is receding. And I'm all for radical changes in this regard. So we have to do a lot of work. It boils down to what teachers can do, and naturally, to some extent, it also boils down to what parents can do at home. Right, parents have a huge role to play in sort of creating this type of environment or space where students are really nurtured from the get-go, and not nurtured for a particular outcome naturally, but just in terms of being able to think better, ask better questions. Like you must have heard, there are parenting styles where sometimes the parent gives an answer to shut down the child because it's just easier. Right, here, you asked a question, I gave you an answer. That's it. End of story. But it takes a little bit more effort to formulate a question in response to a question. Right, and that really sets off the mind of the child in a very, very inquisitive path. And the children end up asking more questions that way over time. They are less prone to being swiftly shut down by a quick answer. But then what they're actually looking for very often, even in a classroom setting, is not an answer. They're looking for a dialogue. They're looking to be engaged. They want to be able to have a conversation about a thing. They're not just looking for one quick factual thing, which they might actually be able to find by having good Google skills, right? So basically, it falls a lot on teachers and parents to improve. We have to improve a lot. We have to get better.
Wow. This also brings me to the second part where you try to introduce history to high school students. What is your idea of history, and how should it be taught to students without actually building that classroom setting of learning dates which we are used to learn in history, without those stuffs coming into picture? What should be the correct idea of getting history to the students?
Ooh, okay. So I honestly did not anticipate to be talking about history today, but sure, why not? It's a very fascinating subject. It's a super fascinating subject. In fact, even at the school level, especially, where most of the murdering of history curiosity takes place. Right, I can tell you that when I finished my school, I had zero interest in history. Like, history was not even a subject to talk about. Why would anybody be even bothering about history or geography? I think my story is not actually unique in the sense that having spent those 13, 14 years outside of India, I naturally, like many of my fellow Indians in foreign lands, had many, many questions about where I came from, what my land really was like. And I didn't know much. I had a certain idea, I had a certain fundamental belief, but I didn't know. And so when I was put on the spot on occasion by my curious friends from America or in France, we were there for about 3 years in France, I wasn't necessarily very able to give them a satisfactory understanding or explanation about my own country. I couldn't because I actually didn't know. And I felt fairly embarrassed at the idea that I don't know enough about my country to talk about it. I can't represent it, and I am representing it. I'm at a dinner table when you have 7 people from a different country, and I'm the lone Indian. I haven't signed up to do this, but I am actually effectively the ambassador for the country at that moment, right? And if I have the capacity, not everybody will have, but for sure, most people who are listening to this will have, understandably, the capacity to read and reflect. One can learn about these things. And it just came from a genuine interest in learning about one's culture, one's history, and how should it be taught in a classroom. This is an open question. It's a very, very interesting debate. How should history be approached? I think one of the things that I would bring up is this here. take a look at this, the book of beautiful questions. I don't know if you see the full frame in front of you.
Yeah.
By Warren Berger. And so, if history can be approached more through questions than through narratives or facts, it might be super helpful. Obviously, it takes work, right? It takes a substantial amount of work to try and get good questions going, like why did this happen, rather than did it happen, or what could have alternatively happened, or what can we learn from this? Why was so? If you keep asking a whole bunch of whys with the students, and don't pretend to know all the answers to everything, right? I think one thing that really ticks students off is know-it-alls. So people who come the presumption that we have these fancy degrees and backgrounds, or I'm so learned and therefore I know the answer to everything. Students don't necessarily want to engage with that. I think students really like to be a collaborative. They like a collaboration in a classroom environment. So if we can learn in a way together, if we can explore some questions together without clear answers, and it's often the case that I don't necessarily have clear answers, then they might be participants in the journey, right? And if I think history per se is so vast, especially for a country like India with so much diversity and so much depth, it is very, very hard to quote unquote cover Indian history. It's I would even argue that it might be impossible to cover it. But what you can do, I think, what's very doable for teachers is to just spark curiosity, right? I think that's the main thing. If you can spark a particular type of interest and curiosity in the learning of history for good reasons, they will pursue these paths on their own later, because the actual knowledge of a particular period in history is actually not so important, right? It's the ideas of themes, phases, why certain periods took place, what was the point in a certain phase of India's evolution. Like you had the period of the epics, right? The age of epics, the period of the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, which was followed by a certain period, which was followed by the classical period. Why did India go through this type of evolution? And what were the crisis moments in each of these? And what was nature trying to attempt through all this? What is it trying to attempt now? So it's not necessary that these answers are known in advance before asking them. One can simply ask them. And for students to understand that history is not known, it's not like we know everything about history. Even now, we know so little about history. The idea that you can be curious about history, have a fascination for it, want to know something about it, and not have all the answers. If one can get that much across in a classroom, I think that'll go a long way. So for my own course, at least, that's what I'm trying to get about in my 1 year's 12th standard course in history. And it covers basically from the Vedic times to pre-British India. That's the hope and aspiration that it covers that phase. And it's mostly the curiosity, the sparking of curiosity for students, that I think is more important than the subject matter. The subject matter to some extent is relevant, but it's the attitude towards knowledge that is significantly more important.
Well, that was something really great. And normally, the kind of education that we have, we actually relate curiosity to scientific subjects only, but we actually don't know that how scientific is history and how logical is history also. And the stories that
Yeah.
come up in history, the
Yeah.
things, the scenes that have happened, that have took place in history, are all because of certain reasons and certain logics that all came together and formed what we know as history now. So yeah, that
Yeah, and that's a
was.
good point. So, for example, just the idea of causation is not correlation. You can explore that through history, right? What is the cause of a certain historical event? How do you know it is the cause, right? And if you can go and ask yourself, what are the assumptions we're making about this time, right? Please list these assumptions. What are the assumptions for so many things? That we will very soon get to the idea that we actually don't know, because no amount of searching can give us certain answers, because it is not known, right? So it is actually dealing in a very limited space of information. We only know this much, and we have to infer a certain we have to make certain assumptions, and we're dealing with uncertain knowledge. And so even that idea of grasping and working with uncertain knowledge objectively for me is a training. And naturally, if I can sort of try and bring that in a classroom, it should be a training for students as well, right? And the skills of learning history, the skills that one can get by learning history, I think can go a long way. It's not so much about, I mean, okay, I brought this, like, um, here is Kamala Subramaniam, one of the finest books on the Ramayana. There's a similar book of hers on the Mahabharata. So these are very fine books to read if one is truly interested in the epics, and the epics are foundational to India. But that requires curiosity, right? Who will actually spend time reading a book that is this thick? Okay, it's about
Right.
an inch and a half according to my measure, right? So that's the hard part. Who will do it?
Hmm.
And to me, the answer is the only person who will actually want to do it is somebody who is genuinely curious about it, right?
Hmm.
And genuinely wants to know. So rather than make any of this course material or teach from it, you have to somehow find a way to light the fire. And
Right.
yeah, that's the hard part. So the books are not so important.
Great, great. Just a last one, sir, for this podcast. What are some of the crucial things that you have learned over the years through your experiences that you more or less often try to impart through your teachings, or try to tell to your students of my age, or to people who are trying, who have just started their journey of figuring out a lot of stuffs in lives? What are those some
Yeah.
crucial things which you like to share?
So I think the easiest one is to be curious, to be continually curious, to be relentless in one's learning and pursuit of learning, to ask, to seek out mentorship. And I was lucky earlier on to come across some really fine people who ended up being my mentors.
Hmm.
And that council of elders, so to speak, grew over time. And so I was super lucky to be able to engage with them, to ask, to be vulnerable in front of some people is important. It's
Right.
not always a good idea to feel that one knows everything. I mean, for sure most people are aware of that, but you have to be willing to share your most the largest questions that you may have with some people whom you can trust. And I think mentorship can go a long way. So if you think about the earliest examples, Plato was a disciple of Socrates. He learned
Hmm.
under Socrates, right? And Plato was a fantastic teacher. So imagine having Socrates as your teacher. And similarly, Plato was a teacher to Aristotle, right? So in the Western tradition, these are the most famous examples of mentorship that really, really went a long way. So what's
Hmm.
the idea here? The idea is very simple: uh, to stand on the shoulders of giants, right?
Hmm.
So these giants may or may not be alive. So in some cases, one can find fantastic individuals in real life, but in many cases, you might find great individuals who belong to a certain age in the past, whom you
Hmm.
can learn a ton from, who may not be physically around, but hey, for example, there's Walter Isaacson's biography of Da Vinci. It's one
Hmm.
of the finest biographies. Another physicist by the name Fritjof Capra wrote a book on learning from Da Vinci. So I really treasure these books because it's learning about a fantastic, phenomenal polymath type individual, and you can actually make so many connections through life by just reading a ton. And reading is mostly free now. You can download books now. It's just incredible. So seeking out mentors, I think, is super helpful. Reading a ton, being curious, and working hard. Obviously, there's absolutely no substitute for working hard. One has to be
Right.
able to work incessantly without anybody coming to pat you and appreciate you for that work. It will those things take care of themselves. But there is no free lunch also. So I think the idea that something is due to me, like, I think a very fundamental idea, especially with the younger generation, that it's important to get across, is that nothing is going to come easy. And
Hmm.
we will all have to earn our space and place in this world, and it will come through tremendous effort and sacrifice. So
Right.
that idea, embracing that idea, is, I think, a key in this pursuit of the bigger picture.
Great, great. Thanks a lot, sir. It was a real pleasure talking to you. The conversation was very, very, very much like great. And thanks for doing this. Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you, Kushagra. Good to speak with you. Have a good, wonderful day.
Thanks a lot,
Bye.
sir. Bye bye.
Bye.